10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail through to organizational transformation and on to changes in society and the world. My name's Andy Polaine. I'm a designer, educator, and writer. Throughout my career, I've learned more about creativity and design through writing than anything else. I think it's partly because words are so universal, yet so tricky, and partly because writing, or good writing at least, forces you to slow down. There's no shortcut or menu item for an instant second draft. You have to write the first draft first. My guests today are Michael J. Metz and Andy Welfle, authors of Writing is Designing, Words and the User Experience, about to be published by Rosenfeld Media in January. Michael has a background in journalism and says he frequently finds himself talking about the role words play in designing useful, usable experiences. And when Andy was 8, he wanted to be a poet and a paleontologist. 28 years later, he's neither, but he uses those skills in his day job as a content strategist on Adobe's product design team, writing under huge constraints and uncovering artifacts from big old software interfaces. Michael and Andy, welcome to Power of 10.
So excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
So first of all, congratulations on the book. It's finished. Did it take you longer than you thought? No one ever says this book took me far less time than I imagined it would.
It was nothing really. We just breezed through it. It was fine. Michael, I don't know what your experience is, but I think we stuck pretty close to deadlines, right?
Yeah, the deadlines. I think the actual writing the words didn't take as long as all the other pieces of putting it together. So that was encouraging.
All the sweeping up at the end takes ages, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Totally.
So it's coming out in January, right? Because I read a preview, I think.
Yep. I think the official date is January 14th. Or 14th January to our British and European
The 14th of January,
friends.
I would say. Yes, that's right. I love that we're already getting down in the nitty-gritty.
Localizing it. Yep.
So if you go to Rosenfeld Media, you'll find it there. And I'm sure you'll find it on Amazon and a few other places too. So my very first question is, there's quite a lot of content strategy books out. There's quite a few content design books out there. Is this a content design book? Because quite early on, right at the beginning, you kind of talk about being designers of words. And it made me think you're wanting to kind of make a differentiation there. And just before we were recording, you were saying there's maybe a bit of a kind of European versus US understanding of this.
Yeah. I think in the US, content design and content strategy, at least when applied to like in a UX context, like a product context, is a little bit more muddy. And it's certainly different wherever you go in the US. But we had a long talk with our publisher about what audiences and what roles we want to target. And at some point, we just realized that we're trying to instill a good UX writing practice among anyone, not just UX writers, among PMs, among designers, anybody on a product team. So we tried really, really hard to remove roles from the responsibilities here, just because these are good things for visual designers to know too, or PMs. So we're kind of pleading the fifth, or at least, trying to be silent about what roles this is for. Really, anybody on a product team who's thinking about the user experience and needs to write the words would get something out of this book, we think.
And I think there's I talked in the introduction about words being universal yet tricky. And my experience is, I have the same publisher as you. I'm a writer too. I wouldn't say I don't necessarily use it. I'm not a content designer or a UX writer. But I think that the tricky thing with words is everyone uses them, right? So in the kind of archetypal, everyone's a designer, and what they actually mean is kind of everyone's got an opinion about design. It's even worse with words in a sense, because everyone writes emails, right?
Yeah.
So is that part of the kind of the manifesto, if you like, that you're trying to get across, to actually be just more considered about the words you're using and to get everyone to kind of understand that these things that are kind of ubiquitous everyday things actually really matter?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we touch on just slightly in the book is how in a more traditional design job, you're going to have a tool that typically serves as a gatekeeping mechanism and allows you to be the person who is doing the designing, right? Because you have this complex tool. Maybe it's a Sketch or InVision or Acture or something like that. So you have a design tool, and because you know it really well, then people are kind of relying on you and looking to you to make these design decisions and see like where the button should go and what color they should be and all those kinds of things. So I think it's more of a challenge with the language because you don't have that thing to rely on constantly, but it means that you just have to work around it in a different way, and you have to solve the problem. You have to rely on influence. You have to rely on helping people learn about it through evidence and data. And that's more challenging, but I think better in the long run, because you have to really build this mentality amongst your team that language is important and that it really affects the experience people have with what you're building.
It's interesting. What you described there was kind of design, or at least visual design, or some of those other forms of design, as a kind of secular priesthood where there's certain people have access to the truth, if you like, and other people are outside it. And in fact, they use Latin, don't they, for their words so often with lorem ipsum.
Yeah.
And yet in your case, the masses use words all the time. And so there's a kind of recalibration that needs to happen. But you talk about being a designer of words, and you talk about the idea of fitting design and writing together in your brain. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because it's a slightly different approach to thinking about, it's a different approach to thinking about writing, I would say, actually, as much as anything else.
I think that the approach is what's different, as you said. So when you're designing with words, it's a matter of how intentional you're trying to be about them and making your decisions visible to the people you're working with. So you have all kinds of options. So you could write things in sentences. You could write things in short phrases. You could write things that sound goofy and wacky, or you could write things that sound very serious and formal. And making those decisions visible instead of just going with them and just using whatever you end up with. That's kind of what we're getting at with designing the words. You're applying a level of rigor to what you write, and you're helping people see the decisions that you make. So I think that's really important. And I think another aspect of designing with words is that you're relying on users to shape what you write and not just what you want to write. So with the book, it was very much, when we wrote a book, it was very much about what we wanted to say on this topic. But when you're writing for an interface, you're not writing about what you want to say. You're writing to solve a problem for someone, or to help them through a flow, or to help them accomplish a goal. And that's a very different way to write than a lot of the writing that people do day to day.
And I think we're just trying to show the full stack of strategy behind it, right? Like we get into, voice and tone strategy, which is very kind of like high level and abstract, and find ways to make it a little bit more concrete. And then we actually like zoom into, writing stress cases and error messages and writing for clarity. And we really kind of zoom into the specifics of kind of how that manifests. So I think that full spectrum of strategy into the Chrome, into the actual writing of the words, is what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, you have a lot of really good examples, and you've got a whole section on inclusivity. And one of the things you talk about, and in fact, Andy, I think you talk about your sister, right?
I do. Yeah, we tried to fill the book in a little bit with just some personal anecdotes and stories, and I talk a little bit about one of my sisters. So I come from a pretty big family. I have 4 younger sisters, and one of them uses a wheelchair, although she's not paraplegic. She uses it to get around, and she is an amazing athlete. She plays on the wheelchair basketball team for the University of Texas in Arlington, and they're kind of an incredible talent. Like she played on the USA team for the USA national team, which won a world championship last year. And I was just talking to her a little bit about just the language that people use throughout digital experiences when referring, and really anywhere, referring to people with disabilities or disabled people, as we talk about in the book. And there's a lot of talk about, just like, oh, this person has overcome so much odds. It is inspiring. And I really tried to get her reaction and get her opinion to this. And she's like, well, I really want people to know that I'm just overcoming the odds of being an athlete and getting good at basketball, and not because I'm in a wheelchair. So I think we just tried to frame some of the language that people use when talking about disabled people or LGBT people or autistic people. Try to reframe that and just get some opinions from people from those populations themselves. So that was a fun thing to write about for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also because like most inclusive design, it sort of works in reverse really well in the sense that if you think more carefully about those cases that might not be in your kind of general everyday life, and you talk about quite a lot of the cases where people say, well, it's only 5% of our users who's going to care about that, and or it's not such a big deal, and these, the classic thing about edge cases aren't actually edge cases; they're millions of people in some cases.
Yeah.
But you talk about, so just going back to your sister, you talk about, saying avoiding language that assigns values to traits. So, instead of saying she's confined to a wheelchair or she's wheelchair bound, you just say, well, she uses a wheelchair. Right?
Yeah.
Which also implies freedom. But you also sort of do it when you're talking about trying not to exclude users. And I thought this example was really good, where you say, avoid saying Adobe Photoshop is for graphic designers, photographers, illustrators, and 3D artists. And instead say Adobe Photoshop helps you create graphics, photographs, illustrations, and 3D art. And it's just such a subtle shift and a reframe that shifts it from being prescriptive and exclusive to something much more inclusive.
That's a really good point. And for sure, something that I think crosses the boundaries of like in-product UX writing and into marketing and into advertising as well. There's a lot of really good work on our team that my coworker Sarah Smart did, just kind of around inclusive UX writing practices, and that was a big piece of it.
Yeah.
And when we kind of presented that to a lot of the writing teams, writing marketing copy at Adobe, they were just like, "Oh, that's brilliant, that's great." So we've been able to kind of like cross silos and influence other parts of the company, which is cool.
I mean, you talk about also in your description of yourself of kind of writing under huge constraints and uncovering artifacts from big old software interfaces. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure, we could go all day about this.
Well, what kind of constraints? Let's start with constraints.
Sure.
So what you say under huge constraints. So what kind of constraints do you face in your day job to make it more sort of real for people, I guess?
A big part of it is organizational constraints, right? Like Adobe is a big siloed tech company that was founded 36 years ago or something like that. And Photoshop, for example, has been around for 30 of those years. And there's often just a lot of product silos that Adobe Design, which is the big product design team that we cross over, but still kind of have to operate within. And oftentimes there's different levels of review and change that happens when you have to like dig into changing some words. So Photoshop, for example, has so many layers of code that is hard baked into it. I've encountered error messages before that me and a designer and an engineer have sat down and tried to dig into and find so we can change it. And we've had trouble doing that because there's error messages that have been baked in for decades. So we have constraints like that, but then we also have constraints about terminology. We have such a wide suite of products, and we want to try to make sure we're staying consistent. And oftentimes we come into like some product come into being through acquisition and comes with their own set of terminology. So do we change terminology to be consistent with the system and alienate some users, some existing users, or do we make it easier for newer users that are coming to the product, by changing? So that's the age-old question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with something like that because there's also a lot of, there is a lot of professional jargon too. And my dad, he's 82 and he was a graphic designer. So if he uses, Illustrator or something or InDesign, he understands a lot of the terminology. He probably understands M's and N's and all the rest of it better than many of us do because he knows how to do an actual kind of print design. And so he can kind of use it, but he comes really unstuck when it comes to, I don't know, saving a file or save as or something like that, because he has no mental model of a kind of the desktop and the kind of filing system stuff. And so, there you've got a thing though where professionals are used to seeing certain kind of language, and as you shift it, if you shift it to be in some respects sort of more inclusive, because you're instead of using the jargon, you're kind of making it more less kind of technical, you're then going to start sort of alienating those professions who are kind of used to using it. And you have a section in the book which is about the use of jargon, and it's not like taboo. It's not like never use jargon. It's kind of avoid it, but sometimes use it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think jargon is an area where maybe we take an unpopular position because I think there's been a big movement that's really largely good. And that movement has been all about making sure that you're using plain language when you're communicating with your users. And there are so many good reasons to do that. There are reasons that there's less cognitive load, it's more usable, easier to read, easier to scan, all those things. But in some cases, jargon can actually help you. And there's an example in the book of a piece of software that I worked on that was designed for people who are designing machines. They're putting together conveyor belts and systems of drives and pulleys and all the different bits that go into making this machine. And it uses terms that if you were someone just opening up that software with no context for this world of machine design, you wouldn't really understand anything. There were things like load and mass and incline, and all those different pieces were being put together in this interface. So it would have been the wrong thing for me to try to make those more plain language in that case. Now, there are pieces of the software that we should have tried to make simpler and plain language. Like if they encounter an error message, knowing how to recover from that, that's really important to write in plain language. But you also need to learn about the people who are using the interface and make sure that what you're using reflects their mental model for the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk about error messages, and can you talk about errors and stress cases? Errors always strike me as being the most sort of under-designed touch point ever, and a real missed opportunity. You probably travel quite a lot. I see so many errors on, there's some kind of Windows, it's probably NT or something, but there's some kind of Windows thing driving displays in airports of, show you your flight times and stuff. And I just see these error messages flashing around. I always think, that you're just broadcasting how kind of rubbish this is to everyone in here. What a lost opportunity. And yet, there are other, famously, there are, like Slack. You use Slack as quite a lot of examples in the book, where the way they kind of talk about errors has a lot more personality in it. But errors also obviously lead to stress because people get kind of caught. I mean, it's a classic, goes right back to sort of Don Norman's early books of a classic moment where the rising panic around an error, particularly in the context of a parent trying to do something, let's say, for their kids, creates more stress and then panic, and then they really don't know what to do, and you get that sort of rabbit in the headlights thing. You make a point of talking about them in terms of stress cases instead of edge cases. Can you talk about that reframing?
Sure. And that framing didn't come from us. That came from the book Design for Real Life by Sarah Wachter-Boettcher and Eric Meyer. And that concept, I think, is important to just keep perpetuating as an industry. Just flip the notion on its head that it's not about a small group of users that don't really matter, but it's about a big, important group of users that could be alienated from what you're creating if you don't accommodate them. So stress cases, rather than thinking about it as stress cases instead of error states or edge cases, it's a really important way to exemplify that this is a moment where someone could be going through something really difficult, and it's important to meet them where they are. So another thing that we talk about that I think is really important is for teams to think of errors not as something to write, but as problems to solve and as opportunities to help people. So the framing we give is, like the best error message is one that doesn't even have to happen because you anticipated it and resolved it before it occurred. Right. And that's another reason why I think writers will really benefit from beginning to think of themselves as designers, because sometimes you'll get a spreadsheet sent over to you and someone will say, we need you to write all these error messages. And you don't even get to have that opportunity to have the conversation with your team around what's really happening here. How can we meet people where they are? Yeah, exactly. Yep. There's real life happening in the midst of this. So how can we figure out how to resolve those problems for people rather than just writing a message and then moving on?
There's one that you use in the book, and I think it's about an insurance company. I think it's one of you actually had this as a case or in your work. And in that, there was a thing about we need an error message for when someone puts in an age that's greater than 100 years old, because the system doesn't allow, or the policy or something doesn't allow anyone to put in an age that's more than 100 years. And what happens with that is you start kind of laddering up, and because you go, well, hang on, if I could just write an error message, but why does that policy even exist, and what's going on here? What was going on there?
So that was a story that I had, and it was a difficult scenario to even unpack what was going on. So the engineer came to me and said, we've got this issue with the policy and we need you to write the error message for it. And I just couldn't believe that this existed, because it would just be like a hard stop for people who were over a certain age. And that didn't seem like something that would just even from a business perspective, it's not going to be good for the product that we were trying to build. So it ended up that I would just get involved in conversations that got deeper and deeper into where this came from. Is it a policy? What group sets the policy? Can I meet with them about it and talk with them about it? So it started a lot of conversations, and it was really hard to unpack. Ultimately, that product was discontinued before we actually got that piece in place. But I think the conversation was still valuable for our whole team to have and to go through that process of looking and pulling at this thread. When you're in a big enterprise company like that, it can feel like a problem like that is just too hard to solve and impossible to get through. But you can just keep asking questions and you can just keep pulling at that thread. And even if you aren't ultimately successful, the people you're working with to try to raise this issue and try to solve it, they're all benefiting from being able to pursue doing the right thing in this scenario.
It's amazing though, isn't it? There's such a small thing, that request to come through, we need an error message for that. Actually then sort of you pull on it and it unravels into such a complex bundle of policies and procedures and probably software things as well in there. I'm wondering, I didn't know whether it was a 2-digit thing or whether it was, you could only go up to 99 or whether it was to do with the policy.
It's like the Y2K bug.
Something else if people over. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's fascinating. But it also struck me that, that kind of work, error messages, labels are often sort of band-aids on top of some other problem. And it's a bit like I often say when doing kind of contextual research, have a look for where people have put up, particularly in like sort of government offices and stuff like that, have put up handmade signs saying, on a door that says this is not a door, or, don't use this button, go to that button over there, and all that kind of stuff, because it's trying to fix something that isn't actually working. And it's the people on the ground who get asked 1,000 times a day. And a lot of those things, any sort of stickers and things, always seem to be a kind of a fix after the fact, although we didn't think that through, and now we're going to have to put a sticker on this to kind of tell people to, that this hot tap is hot.
Did you see that thing that Jonathan Coleman posted recently on his social media? The head of content design at Intercom. It was a credit card reader that said, just like in so many stickers, it just said like, press yes to continue, press yes to continue, press yes to continue. And people still ask, how do I continue? So yeah, maybe we don't need more signs telling people to press yes to continue. Maybe we need to reframe that question in the first place.
I have a photo and now I don't know where it's from actually. I'm going to have to do a reverse search from it. I used to use it in talks quite a lot. And it's a ticket machine in a car park, an underground multi-story car park. And it's just covered in stickers. And it says, do this first, press the grey button, and then, press the grey button first. But there's 2 of them on the screen, and there's more and more stickers over it. Clearly, whoever kind of works there has just got so frustrated, but they've sort of made it worse every time.
Yeah.
But it's a very good example of how kind of words then, when it says, in this case, says press the grey box on the screen first, but there's 2 grey boxes on the screen. There's sort of lack of clarity about that. And in fact, you talk about this quite a lot in terms of don't use the kind of locations of things. Instead, use the sort of chronology of things and to structure language quite differently.
Yeah, that was a big part of our chapter about inclusivity and accessibility. I think that's a good tip for writing for accessibility because, when a screen reader is kind of walking a blind person or somebody who just needs to use the screen reader through that interface, like, press the blue button on the left isn't going to be useful at all to them. But if you frame it as a continuum, like in a chronology, like, next, choose go, right? Like next, do this, and previously, and then finally do this. It makes a lot more sense. So I think that's a really, really simple trick that, a lot of people who aren't thinking about that overlook for sure.
It reminds me of that classic assignment you sometimes got set in school, which is, imagine aliens have come down to Earth and you have to tell them how to use a phone booth or something like that. But it's a very good kind of way of then checking your assumptions.
Yeah.
I want to sort of move on to voice and tone because you make the distinction between the two. And actually, sort of earlier on, you talk about irresponsible writing and being careful of sort of weaponizing words too. And you talk about this idea of confirm shaming. Can you tell us what confirm shaming is? Because I think it's a good example of tone of voice too, or tone and voice.
So confirm shaming, this I think originated, as far as I can tell, with a Tumblr blog, confirmshaming.tumblr.com, which just collects examples of blatantly manipulative Mostly they're for people to sign up for newsletters. So they're like little modals that come up, and you can enter your email address, or you can say something akin to like, no, I hate myself and I don't want to enter my email address.
I want to be miserable on Monday morning.
No, I do not want to save 20%.
Yeah, I hate money. So you put words in people's mouths for them, and do that sort of hoping that it will result in more email addresses in your database. And I didn't even know. I've been involved in a team that was, like trying to work on increasing their numbers. I don't think they got to that point where they're trying those types of messages, but I'd be surprised if these things are even really effective in terms of getting the results people want from them. But regardless of that, they're just not ethical, right? It's a terrible way to treat people as a business. Yeah. So that's a really clear way where your business, like even if you're doing really great things and selling cool products, immediately just becomes less credible as soon as someone sees that.
It's funny if you made those things a real life thing and someone came up to you, I don't know, you're walking through a station and someone said, would you like a sample of our product? Or do you want to be a dick? I mean, you would never kind of do that, right?
I would like to be a dick, please.
But somehow in the digital world, I know. Somehow in the digital world, that seems to be okay.
I think people see it as, often that gets written in a silo as just like a little growth hack or a trick. And they're just kind of not thinking about how it represents kind of that larger voice that a brand or a product might try to have. So it's definitely like, probably they're not trying to like be that manipulative in the rest of the voice, but it's such an early top of funnel good example of, how you can just sort of break people's understanding and opinion of you quickly.
Yeah, it's just an immediate turn off, isn't it? So what's the difference between tone and voice?
So I can take this one. So I am me. I am Andy. I'm always, have the same personality. I try to come at everything I do with the same set of values and the same set of interests coming from a personal level. And that's my voice. That's me. But the way that I talk to my sisters, or the way that I talk to my college roommate, or the way that I talk to Michael when we're book planning, and the way that I'm talking here in this podcast, these are all shifts in tone just to try to accomplish different goals. So I'm trying to just explain what I wrote in my book in this podcast. And therefore, I'm going to be a little bit more educational. I'm going to try to slow down and, frame some things before we get into it. And that's specifically just to make sure to give the right context and to get people interested in the book. So I think that, software or, digital experiences can do the same thing. You have kind of your core values, you have your voice that you need to accomplish. And sometimes that can be the same thing as your brand voice. Sometimes that can be very different.
Like Slack was, you talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, Slack's kind of in-product voice and brand voice are very similar.
Can you give an example of when there's a slight difference between that?
Honestly, I'll just go ahead and pick on my own company that I feel comfortable picking on, which is Adobe. Oftentimes, our brand voice is trying very much to be at the intersection of like technology and creativity, right? We want to talk to artists and designers and creative people, but we also want to make sure that they know that we have, a very deep scientific engineering approach to enabling them to be creative. And that's great. Like we really want to be like captivating and interesting and passionate and, really speak to their creativity. But that's not super useful in the product. They just want to get in there and actually, use it, draw something on the canvas or figure out how to edit, a video clip or make something very simple. So we really want to focus on clarity or being very straightforward and sometimes brevity too. Like we have a different set of principles we need to carry through in the product. So I don't think it's necessarily always the case. Sometimes when you have a very, very product forward company, your brand voice and your product voice can be the same. Sometimes you have different goals inside the product and then also like for your brand.
So you would have in an Adobe product, you might have something kind of very inspiring or in the branding and sometimes even in the kind of splash screens and stuff, but you're not going to go up to file new. It's just going to say
start creating now or whatever. Yeah.
New kick-ass kind of. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right.
And that idea of separating voice and tone, it's something that I think the first example I really saw widespread was MailChimp from back in the day. And they made their voice and tone guidelines public. Sadly, I don't think it's live anymore. You could maybe check it out through the Wayback Machine, but it was voiceandtone.com. And they put their principles out there and showed how tone should and can change in different situations. And that was, I think, a big moment for a lot of people working in tech to realize how central language is to the experiences we're working on every day. One of the people who worked at MailChimp at the time, Kate Kiefer Lee, also co-wrote a book called Nicely Said, where they get into voice and tone as well. So that could be another great resource.
One of the really nice examples I heard of this was from R1, which is the A1, the Austrian telecom company. And there was a project there, I think it was called the Wording Project or something. Now, in German, you get a very formal version of German. And there's even this kind of thing called Beamtersprache, which is like bureaucracy speak, And it's very, very formal, and it's very kind of roundabout in the way it uses an awful lot of kind of passive tense and stuff. And also you have the formal see and the informal do. So you do your friends, but you see some people who are kind of more senior or who you don't know. And one of the things that came out of a lot of the feedback was all of their marketing material, all the stuff on bus shelters and posters and stuff was all in this kind of youthful language. And in general, young people just use the informal with each other, even people they don't know. And it was all around that. It was very kind of young and trendy. But then when the customers got emails or sort of tech support things, or even in the kind of instructions of how to set up their router or something, it was all this really kind of formal language. And they said, you're speaking to me like I'm, a sort of teenager in your advertising, but then after that you speak to me like my grandmother. And there's just this kind of shift in tone that happens, and it destroys the credibility on both sides. Because obviously you can choose, if you're a bank, you'll choose usually to be very formal and, because we're kind of serious and, there's no risk and all of that sort of stuff and trustworthy. Whereas another brand would choose to maintain that kind of youthful thing. And so they did a sweep through and they just went through, everything. They went through the instructions, like I said, to how to set up your router. They went through contracts. They went through all the terms and conditions. But they also went through all the kind of template letters and stuff that the customer service people were sending out. And they made a choice also to respond not only to customers on their own channel, which is a sort of number one thing, but to respond in the style of that customer. So if someone wrote to them very formally, they'd write back very formally. And in one case, someone wrote them a poem, and they wrote back in a poem, just to kind of stay on that same wavelength. I thought it was a really nice example of how a company can actually create much more empathy.
I will only be writing to customer service using limericks now, for sure. See what happens.
In code.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I think that, we talked a little bit about voice, and I think tone is kind of what is the tool that gives us the ability to, either react or be proactive in context. Like you have your brand voice or your product voice, and then you can really use tone to be very supportive and empathetic in a support situation, perhaps. Like somebody is contacting customer service, or somebody's credit card got declined or whatever. And then you could also, within that same set of voice guidelines, use tone to be very motivational and proactive when somebody's trying to get through an onboarding experience. Or probably most of the time, you just want to be very neutral and kind of stay out of the way, recede into the background, and make sure just to give the tools they need to do what they need to do. So I think that's kind of where tone comes in, is that contextual flexibility, right?
But I can imagine getting that set up is also, it's a set of choices, right? And you talk about, this, not that, and defining not just what you are, but also what you're not, is kind of, it limits your palette in a very useful way. Because the problem you have is obviously you could kind of write anything you like, but having those kind of guide rails is really important. It's also quite freeing in the end. And I really like that idea of, I can't remember which example you use where you talk about, we say, maybe it was MailChimp as well. We're this, but we're not that.
Yeah. And interestingly, MailChimp kind of got away from that, but I think it's still very useful when people are starting to think about this. This book kind of came out of a series of workshops that we developed and give at Confab and a few other conferences. And when people get into groups and are given sort of a fictional or sometimes real life company to develop a product voice for, we give this to them. And sometimes people will start putting together a this but not that, and they'll use opposites, right? Like I want to be educational but not vague. And I'm saying, well, that's really like not quite how we want to use it. You kind of want to use the not that as kind of an upper limit or an extreme. So you want to be, educational but not pedantic, for example, and then provide some examples of each of those to really show there's an extreme or I guess an under limit to how you want to come across. And that just really gets you talking about it, gets a group of people together in a room and thinking about like how this could be misused or how you can take this to an extreme. So that's kind of that exercise there, what that's good for.
I think it's incredibly useful. One of the ones from MailChimp was fun but not childish, which I think is a really, it really sort of helps you understand what you mean by this, not that, because fun can easily become
for sure
childish. And I think that kind of some of those, the sort of upper or lower limits of things are, it's very easy to be very aspirational sometimes, I think, and say, oh, we're going to be this and we're going to be inspiring and we're going to be engaging and we use all these kind of things. But it's also very easy to drift into something else if you don't have that other limit set and say, well, we're going to be this, but we're not going to be
for
that.
Sure.
I think it's incredibly useful. There's probably loads more we could talk about, but we are sort of coming up to time. So I have a sort of last question, which I probably should have asked first, which was, I mentioned at the beginning, Arne, I asked you the question, is this a content design book? What gap were you feeling like you wanted to fill with this book, and what do you hope most of all that people will take away from it?
Well, I'm hoping that for people who do the work of writing on different product teams and the people who write words for different experiences, that those people will feel empowered to have conversations that they've never had before and to start feeling like they have a place to actually shape the experience in a meaningful way. So to us, like, we were trying not to say with the book, here's how to do this, but more, here's how to think about this, and here's how to have a conversation about it, and here's how to be intentional about it. So rather than having all the answers, what I hope people come away with is new ways of thinking about the problems they wrestle with every day, so that the next time they get a spreadsheet filled with different scenarios, they're not just having to write it and feel like maybe those solutions are not what they would hope for them to be. I would hope that people who do that writing can start to do work that they feel really proud of and start to feel like they have a hand in shaping the experiences that they're part of creating.
And kind of from the other end of that, I like to think that we're going to get some, writers, people who maybe have, written for magazines or for newspapers and really want to figure out how to get into UX. We can kind of inspire them that like, hey, you can do design work too, even if you're a writer, right? Like you can apply this design methodology to the thing you're already really good at, which is words and communication, and really, really find a valuable career out of that.
So the very final question is, Power of 10 is named after the Eames film Powers of 10, where they zoom out to the universe and back into the sort of subatomic level in Powers of 10. And with it's this idea of design operating at different levels. And you've talked about it quite a lot, a piece of text that might exclude 1% of Facebook users is actually 20 million people. And so my question is, what small thing do you think is maybe sort of overlooked or should be designed or should be redesigned or is designed well, particularly, that has an outsized effect on the kind of macro picture?
I think that we talked about confirm shaming in buttons. I think that even the non-confirm shaming buttons can be just drastically simplified just to get people to understand the action they're taking. I have kind of a personal crusade against the call to action, got it. Google does this a lot. Somebody just wants to have like an OK button or just to like dismiss or acknowledge. And it says, got it. And I've actually been in user research tests where people who, especially when they're coming to English from other languages, just kind of read that as sort of a dismissive rather than an acknowledgement. And it actually often will bear the kind of opposite meaning of what I think that people set out to do. So just really, really drastically simplifying your CTA buttons, I think, would make a huge difference.
Michael?
Yeah, so for me, I am going to pick the notification. And whether it's on your phone as a push notification or as a text message or on your watch or on your computer or in your email, we are inundated with notifications. And they're a huge part of what people are asked to write for these products every day. And I just think that we can sort of see that concept of the power of 10 in an individual's life where people are just inundated with these things. My life has improved drastically since I started denying every app I install notification permissions on my phone. Like they have to have a really good reason to get me to allow them, because it was just being abused so much by the people who make these apps. So I think the only people who can do something about it are the people who are working on it. And I think it just starts to really inundate people. It gets people looking at their phone even when they don't mean to be or don't want to be. You talked in a recent episode with Teresa Neal about how engagement has kind of become synonymous with addiction. And I think that's so true. And I think words really play a major role in that. So I hope that we can solve this problem, not by writing notifications differently, but by being more thoughtful and intentional about when we use them.
So actually one part of writing is knowing when to be silent. Right?
Totally.
Exactly.
Well, what a fantastic place to end. Michael, Andy, where can we find you online?
You can find my website, mjmetz.com. I'm starting to write there more as we get the book out into the world, just telling some stories from the people who were in the book and just writing about the work in general. And you can find me on Twitter at mjmetz, Instagram
Double
at
T.
mjmetz. Yeah, exactly. Double T. And LinkedIn as well.
Brilliant. Andy?
My website, I think you'll appreciate this, Andy. My website is andy.wtf. Sat on that domain name when when the WTF domains rolled around. Or you can find me on Twitter, where I'm most active as @awelfle. And I am on LinkedIn as well. I'm happy to talk to you there, but I'm not super active there.
Okay, great. Well, look, I'll put all the links in the show notes, and I'll put a link to the book and your websites as well. Michael, Andy, thanks very much for being my guests on Power of 10.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
You can find the transcript of Power of 10 on thisishcd.com, where you'll also find the other podcasts on the network. My name's Andy Polaine. You'll find me online as Polaine on Twitter and most other places, and also Polaine.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.